Thanks very much for speaking with us, Sanjiv. It's -5 degrees, so you owe me thank you for not exposing you to the elements outside. But it has been a year of being exposed to the elements for the NBFC sector, hasn't it? In the recent past, we've finally seen growth slow down and moderate. So I think if you look at whether it's the industry-wide data, which suggests that consumer lending growth in the third quarter has moderated from about 23% growth to 13%, or the quarter update that your company itself put out, which suggested that there has been a slight moderation in growth, much lower for you all than for the broader industry. How much of this is intended slowdown by companies like yours and others?
So, Manika, first, it's good to be back on BloombergQuint at Davos 2020. And it's much nicer to be in today, though we know the rest of the week is going to get warmer.
Yes, thankfully.
Today is a very cold day. It was -13 degrees when I reached Davos this morning. See, the business, as you know, we run a number of financial services businesses, but our lending business gives us early insights to what's happening on the ground on the consumer side, because we do a large number of consumer loans, almost 100,000 loans a day, and also on the SME side. And we've been seeing for the last 4 or 5 quarters initially slowdown in SME, and then the last 3 quarters slowdown on the consumer side. And many reasons. The clearly loss in confidence on the economy has driven this slowdown. We've seen, of course, a lot of action that the government and RBI has taken to provide liquidity to the sector, and I'll come to NBFCs in a bit. But while all that liquidity is available, it is of course available to the better quality NBFCs, and correctly so. But given that consumer confidence is still low, it has had only limited impact. Now, early signs in the last 4 or 5 weeks, we are seeing some uptick on the consumer lending side. But I think it's still too early to say whether this is sustainable. I'd like to see how the rest of Jan, Feb and March go before we see whether we've... I think we've clearly reached the bottom, but are we making our way up or not?
Specific categories that you might have seen some of this uptick in?
So, we are seeing this in consumer durables, electronics, home electronics. We are seeing this in digital products. These are 2 of the highest categories. Small value, but instant purchases on the consumer side. And we typically look at festival periods. So, as you know, last week has just been Onam and Sankranti and every Pongal and everything else. And we've seen about a 15 to 17% growth year on year. Now, in past years, that growth could be as high as 30, 40, 50%. But there is still some growth that we are seeing over there. 26th Jan ends up being a very big day, and we want to see what
how that
growth,
works out.
how that pans out, and that's pan-India. So we'll see how that pans out. The larger issue clearly has been of NBFCs and their health. And in many ways, I think the market has segregated between the better quality NBFCs and those that were not. And by quality, I don't just mean quality in terms of consumer credit. I also mean business model. If you look at the last decade, 2000 to 2010, the successful NBFCs were mostly monolines. And they were the ones getting backed by the stock market. They were the ones getting funding. And we decided with Bajaj Finance to build a diversified NBFC. And the answer was really very simple, that you didn't want to get exposed to any one business line, because businesses go through up and down cycles. And that's the reason why we built a diversified book. And I think it took 5 years for the industry to understand that. But today every NBFC wants to do that. But the book still isn't that. So, as we've seen, very large exposure, some of the large NBFCs to the real estate sector. Now, as real estate slowed down, they were caught in a hard place, and they could not diversify fast enough. Plus, many of them had very chunky wholesale loans. And that's got them in a tight space. Now, as much additional liquidity that the banks have, why would they lend to some of these entities if they can see significant red on their balance sheets? So we have to see the cycle play out. There is no other way. We are seeing some amount of consolidation, we are seeing cleaning up, And those things are messy. They take time. There will be NBFCs that have gone down, some that will go down. But I see the industry coming out of it far stronger.
Okay, where are we in the cycle anyway to gauge? The reason why I ask this is that, last year when we were speaking, we were just coming off the immediate impact of IL&FS in January 2019.
Yes.
Since then, we've had a couple of other large NBFCs fall into trouble, DHFL being, a case in point, just nothing else. So it doesn't seem as if the problems have stabilized or are petering out at this point in time. And there's a lot of nervousness in the marketplace, which is why when I asked you the first question on growth moderating, it seems to me that large and small NBFCs might also be looking at the quality of assets available at this point and saying, hey, maybe we should cut down on growth, the frenetic growth that we saw in the last 5 years. So my questions are sort of a combination of your continuing concern about asset quality and where in the cycle we might be.
As far as where the cycle is with respect to these NBFCs and some of these HFCs, clearly the cleanup is underway. But see, last 2 years we've had a new bankruptcy code. For it to settle down, for the courts to settle down, takes many years. You can't expect it to work efficiently from day one. We've seen some very large companies go through bankruptcy court and final decisions have come out. Many others have to happen. So we're still in that cycle where it's taking much longer to resolve than was anticipated earlier on. But there is no other way to go through. The system needs to learn. So I think that still takes time. As far as the better quality NBFCs chasing, I would say, good quality growth now, that is very much true. It's true for all of us. Because at the end of the day, with consumer loans, with SME loans, we're giving loans from anything from 15, 20,000 rupees to a few lakh of rupees, maybe 30, 40, 50 lakh rupees. And our payments come back in 6 months to 24 months. So really all you're trying to do is to judge the credit worthiness of the borrower and his or her ability to pay in that period of time. Now, we know the super rich are not going and taking loans that are 25, 30,000 rupees. These are middle class, lower middle class customers who, many of them, if they're in their 30s, 40s, have an EMI on their house, have an EMI on their car, and then they spend some additional amount on these products. So what we've always done is we've seen that of the take-home pay, EMI should not form more than 60% of the person's salary, so that there is enough left to run the house and to run their lives. If it starts going up, then we end up not lending to those people till they bring down their leverage. Now at a time like this, people or lenders will end up being more careful, and I think that's only fair. When you're building long-term, good quality businesses, you have to know when to dial down when the economy is slow, and then you dial up when the better times come.
So some of the growth moderation is intended growth moderation by some of the large NBFCs.
Very clearly. Even we, if you see in our last couple of quarters, while we are still growing well, and I won't get into details or numbers because we have earnings, our results later this month, but our growth, while still strong, is slower than what it was last year or the year before that. And it's conscious. We have cut out the bottom 15-20% of our approvals normally because we feel that those people are leveraged at a level where if salaries are not going up, they're not going to, or they may not end up meeting those obligations. And that's a responsibility that as lenders we must have. We can't just keep lending indiscriminately either.
Yeah, but some of the numbers are still quite alarming, if I may say so. So I'm looking at CIBIL data, which suggests that while there's been a stark moderation in lending growth from 23%, like I said, in December 2018 to 13%, I'm talking about the quarter ended. When it comes to credit cards and personal loan growth, it's been gangbusters. Credit card, up 40%, personal loan growth, unsecured, I'm imagining, 28%. So square this for me. If responsible large NBFCs of yours are cutting out the bottom 15%, as you're saying, because you're concerned now about the viability of your customers, where is this growth coming from? 40% credit cards, 28% personal loans. who's putting this money to work, and how concerned should we be of all of these assets then hitting us in the face another 1 year down the line?
So let's take this one by one. If you look at credit cards, India's penetration of credit cards is amongst the lowest amongst the top 30, 40 countries in the world.
Sure, yeah.
So we're talking of total of about 40, 45 million credit cards, maybe 25 million unique users out of 1.3 billion people, versus I think close to 800 million or a billion debit cards. So there's that customer, I mean, there's a very large segment there, which if you smartly identify those customers, the credit card volume in India should be 10 times what it is today. So you could still go after good quality customers who have not been carded, and that's part of the reason that you're seeing the growth over here.
Okay.
As far as personal loans are concerned, I know that we've cut down our approvals. Now here what I see is, if you again see the last 4 or 5 years, you have a whole new set of NBFCs, PE funded or otherwise, or ex-bankers who have set up their own NBFCs, who looked at this as a good space to build up business, and they won't get a bank license. So the NBFC is the next best license to have. And leveraging technology, leveraging data, they are growing. I don't see them growing as gangbusters anymore, so you're not going to see 100, 200, 300% growth on what would have been a very small base. But any growth that comes adds to the sectoral growth, because they didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. The last answer is if there's somebody doing this recklessly, but I would be surprised if at this point of time you would see any kind of reckless growth.
I go back to what I asked you. We went through Ireland FS, we spoke in January last year. You thought hopefully things would have stabilized. Then a whole bunch of, home finance companies faced issues, especially like DHFL.
Yep.
So we're still struggling through some of those pain points now. I'm wondering whether worsening asset quality is going to continue to be a problem in this sector over the next year or two, not necessarily with large quality NBFCs like yours, but because of the smaller ones that are entering the market and looking to grab growth any which way they can. And therefore next year in Davos, will we be talking about the same problem again?
It depends. One, how quickly does the economy pick up again? And I think this government, and I've been saying that for a few quarters, needs to put aside its fiscal discipline for maybe 24 months and jumpstart the economy. If not, it's going to be a more disciplined but a very slow climb back. And we'll see the budget on the 1st of Feb.
Yes.
If the government does provide that boost and the economy grows, that ends up being positive then for the sector. The second thing that we have to see is where all this additional capital is coming. And again, in today's day and age, data can tell you very clearly what kind of customer you're lending to. So if somebody is smartly using data and lending to the better quality customer, keep in mind we're still 1.3 billion people. I mean, the top 100 million are still spending even in this current slowdown. We are talking of the middle 400 million that have slowed down. So it's a question of how each lender, I would say, leverages data. That's what we do at least. Every decision of ours is driven by data and looking at data in multiple ways. We run multiple projects where small volume of customers, we try different products, we try different interest rates, we try different terms in different parts of the country. We see how they are reacting, and based on that, we decide where to increase exposure and where to reduce exposure.
How concerned should we be about the viability of several players, given the cost of funds has also been peaking quite considerably? Maybe not for companies like yours. You borrow close to sovereign, from what I understand, but for many of the mid-level and small-level players?
I would separate out those exposed to real estate, and especially on the wholesale side, because they have very large chunky exposures, and unless that sector starts improving, you will start seeing trouble over there. I mean, if you look at on the consumer side in the country, the two big sectors that can drive growth up are housing and autos.
Yeah.
And these are the two that are hurting the most, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we have to see whether the government does something about that. If not, then those with wholesale real estate, large exposures, I think will need to recapitalize themselves. The second issue becomes that you have a lot of mid-sized companies. They may not be the best quality NBFCs, but they've been running their business. They understand their business model. But the fact that they are not seen of pristine quality and they are not getting additional debt from banks, because banks are also being careful, and I can understand that. In their case, what will happen is a liquidity problem will become a solvency problem.
Exactly.
So that risk is there, and I think the only answer is for economy to pick up or more equity to come in at a time like this to capitalize those companies and give confidence to the market that they have enough money available to pay their short-term dues.
You might interpret my next question to seem as if I'm looking for a sensational headline, but I'm not. I'm looking for a cautionary sort of comment. Will we see more NBFCs collapse in this year?
Difficult to say. I think a lot depends.
You know this industry better than most, and you can see which ones are in really fragile positions.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, whether they collapse or no depends on two things. One, their ability to raise additional equity, additional capital, and secondly,
but at what
growth.
cost, Sanjiv? I mean, the cost at which they're raising some of that capital will eventually make that business model unviable, right? So I'm just wondering what costs, and even if growth does pick up, it's not going to pick up next month or the month after that. It will take at least 2 quarters for whatever the government does to feed into the economy. So I'm just curious, do you expect that 2020 will also be a year where we might see strain on NBFCs and in fact maybe some having to rethink their existence?
Memory sometimes is short. 12 years ago, 07-08 was the biggest financial crisis that we've at least experienced, and our earlier generation had never experienced a crisis like that. The cost of rebuilding those companies in the US, in the UK, in Europe was very high. But the good ones now are doing really well. So I would not be a pessimist over there. I'm clear we're going through a pain. I'm clear that there's something that the government needs to do to lift this economy up, and there are risks associated with it. There is the risk of fiscal loosening, and then how much you should do. Naturally, there are experts and economists there. I'm not an economist to say that, but we need that tailwind at this point of time to rebuild the sector.
Okay, you've successfully avoided fully answering my question. I do want to talk about the SME space. You spoke of how stress first came into there 4 or 5 quarters ago. We continue to have, small businesses struggling with things like GST, outside of the fact that consumer demand has just dropped off in the last 6-8 months. How much of a concern is that area for the lending industry, so to speak? And are we going to see further deterioration in asset quality there? Will that be a red alarm bell ringing?
The sector has already been slow the last 3 or 4 quarters, and it was both a question of getting used to GST, and this year I also have a role in CII. I chair the Western region, and as we've discussed with the government, there is a significant amount of GST refund that is due to the SME sector from the government. So their cash flow strapped, the economy is slow, and that's why it's tough times for them. I hope the government releases those refunds to the SME sector. I think that will itself be a big boost for them going forward.
Still hasn't happened, so...
Not much, yeah.
So deteriorating asset quality this year? Further deterioration?
Yes. So we've seen, if you see our last quarter results, you can see that our net losses have inched up 10 bips, 20 bips. Now, that's still very low because we run a very tight ship.
Right.
And because we're diversified, we can focus on other segments that are growing with, I would say, relatively good quality. But if I have to see over the last year, we have seen not only a slowdown in that segment, but we have seen some deterioration in credit quality,
So you're saying that by the end of this year, we might end up with a slightly larger NPA problem across the industry from both the SME point of view as well as the personal loans point of view?
I think it's a continuing problem. It's not something that's going to blow up.
Surge. Not a further surge in
I don't expect it to be a further surge. I'm hopeful for no reason. I have no insight, but given where this economy is slowed down, I'm hopeful this government does something to lift us out of where we are. and that should start helping the sector.
And if that doesn't happen?
If that doesn't happen, then you'll see some deterioration or you'll see stagnation.
Some deterioration, could you give me a sort of more specific answer on?
No, so it'll differ from company to company. Very clearly, we've always said that we are here to build long-term businesses, and when we see economy slowing down, when we see that basic credit quality in the sector is deteriorating, we will slow down growth, and we will save our energy for the better day, and that's what we've been doing. But each company will have its own strategy.
From a sector point of view, are we going to see a surge in NPA levels on account of maybe already the developer loans problem, and then additional to that, the continuing issues with SME, and now a bit of fear around personal unsecured loans as well?
As I said earlier, I don't think it gets much worse, but it doesn't get better unless the government provides those tailwinds. See, once that tailwind is provided even for 12, 18 months, momentum will then take us forward. So you can then pull back after 6 quarters.
Okay.
But that's required at this point of time, because you have to keep in mind that if the government does that, look at the entire banking sector. They've been, especially the public sector banks, it's the large value loans which have caused trouble for them. If you see some of the private sector banks also, it is really the large value loans. They are all waiting to get into SME, many into consumer. Some of the private sector banks have their plans very much in place to expand on the consumer side. We just need that initial fillip to come.
Do you see yourself at Bajaj Finance and Bajaj Finserv expanding beyond SME into the broader corporate categories? And let me ask you a question that my colleague Ira, who heads the banking and finance vertical, suggested. She said that, given the absence of development financiers in this country, after IDBI turned into a bank, etc., and after what happened with IL&FS, is that a space that you might ever consider entering? Infrastructure finance, large project finance, maybe not directly through the company that you have right now, but creating arms to consider or look at that?
So let me take the two questions separately.
Yeah.
One is Bajaj Finance. We are broadly in 5 spaces. Consumer lending, which means everything from personal loans to loans for your television, for your mobile phone, for groceries, for your hair transplant, for cosmetic surgery.
People are buying groceries on loan?
Yes. So at Big Bazaar, if you're buying and your spend is more than 5,000 rupees, you get 3 EMIs on the Bajaj Finserv EMI card. And so it's all about enabling the customer.
That's how to eat your cake and have it too, right? Finally, we found out what that phrase means.
Well, we still take the risk on the customer.
Sure, not you, for consumers, I'm saying. Okay, so consumer lending, yes.
So consumer lending. Then we have the SME lending. We've talked about these two. We do commercial lending as well.
I know, but today, it's a smaller part of your book right now.
Much smaller part, because we started 10 years ago with lending to the suppliers of Bajaj Auto. We knew them. We then expanded this to entire auto segments. And we've gone by segments. We lend to light engineering because we believe the dynamics of that segment is still good. We do to financial services. NBFC is much smaller than ours, but of good quality, but who are not able to borrow, or they borrow at very high rates. So we lend to them. So we have a small commercial book. We then have a rural book. And while rural is essentially consumer, the rural customer behaves a little differently. Aspirations are the same, behaves differently. So we look at that vertical independently. And then we have a significant fee-based focus, where, for example, on our consumer durable products, extended warranty, we sell them that. If somebody is taking an SME loan, we cover it with a credit product, a credit insurance product. And we've had cases where the bread earner in the family has passed away, and we've actually worked with the insurance company, paid off the loan, and given the rest of the money to the family. So it's not only about making more money, it's about how you're securing the borrower as well. So there are these 5 segments, and then within that we have multiple product lines. We have totally 35 different product lines in 5 segments. So we are already, that's why, very diversified. 2010 we entered the infrastructure finance space with an infrastructure finance company. We set up a separate company. In about 18 months, we lend to about 15 different borrowers, of course as part of syndicates, and across roads, power, multiple sectors. And our hypothesis was very simple actually, but turned out to be completely wrong. The hypothesis was that India was growing for the last 10 years. Infrastructure was an obvious segment that this country needed. And all over the world, infrastructure lending is a very low risk business because it's a utility. You know, you build a road, you're going to get cars on it, you're going to collect toll. So it's not a high ROE business, but it's a business where you can give chunky loans, so you build up your book. They're long tenor loans, so it stabilizes your business as well. It's low return, so our consumer lending was high return but volatile.
Yeah.
This was supposed to balance that out. What we realized was that in India, we were still not mature as an economy. So approvals got delayed. With a debt to equity of 3-4 to 1, if your project got delayed by 2 years, the penal interest basically wiped out your equity.
Right.
And we realized that in the good times, as we knew this was going to be a segment with low returns. So we were fine with that. But in the bad times, your bottom just basically falls. So that model just didn't make sense. And we luckily in 18 months time stopped, closed that business down. We were able to sell off all our loans at almost no distress. But it took us 2 years to do that. So I don't see ourselves getting into that segment. I think it has very different characteristics. It requires far more maturity. And I sympathize with a large number of those developers. They were good quality developers. Somebody was doing a 100-kilometer road and he just didn't get land from the government for 400 meters.
Right.
And that scuttled his project after he had done 90%, 98% of the work. So we still need to see much more maturity coming into this segment before at least somebody like us would get into it.
So any new areas of business that are still unexplored by you all that you might think is where the next growth impetus comes in from?
In the last 2 years, we've created a subsidiary in Bajaj Finance for housing. And we were doing housing for the last 7-8 years. We learned the business. When it became of material size, we then moved it into a subsidiary and we actually put incremental business over there. So to us, that's going to be a significant business line going forward.
And the smaller ticket homes?
And the smaller ticket homes.
That's been the story for the last year or two.
Yes, so it's a middle class customer. We have recently launched a securities business also as a 100% subsidiary of Bajaj Finance. And this one, once again, we only for our own customers. It's an online platform that allows them to trade and allows us, based on seeing their trading, to be able to lend to them. So do margin funding within the limits allowed to us.
You expect that to be a big growth turner?
Each of it will be steady growth, but in the long term, it can be a very profitable business. Yeah.
Okay. Last final question. When we spoke in Davos last year, you made 2 or 3 things, or you mentioned 2 or 3 things that you thought should be of, critical attention to the regulator and the government. You said that the regulator must treat or regulate NBFCs, especially the large systemically important ones, on par with banks, including with backstops. You said you were expecting consolidation in the sector. You said that you were expecting the government to make moves to ease financing. Some of that has happened through, whether it was through partial credit enhancement, etc. How much of what you thought should be done to help this sector scale, become bigger and be better regulated has happened, and what is left?
There's still a lot that is left.
Because none of the bits that, of bringing banks and NBFCs on par has happened, right?
Correct. And I'm not talking of bringing banks and NBFCs on par. They're two different licenses. But what's clear is that the top 30 or 40 NBFCs in this country are very different from the remaining 11,000. And when we get clubbed together, that doesn't help either set. It's also evidence-based that in the last 5 or 6 years, over half of the incremental credit in the economy, and that's going to consumer and SME, comes from the NBFC sector. So the sector has built certain capabilities. At the same time, many companies have become exceedingly large with sizes that were never thought of was possible before. And this is what I believe that the government and the RBI needs to take note of. We have created a whole new animal. Now you may call it a super large NBFC, you may call it a bank without a bank license, you can call it what you want. It doesn't exist in most other parts of the world. To me, it's a great example where without giving a bank license to everyone, certain companies have built experience and size and capability in the lending space. But we can see that there are still weaknesses on the liquidity side.
Yeah.
Now, Bajaj Finance voluntarily sets aside between 4 and 8% of our borrowings into liquid funds to take care of tight liquidity periods. But nobody else does that. I don't know any other NBFC that does that. And that's where I believe RBI needs to bring in some additional discipline.
Didn't they just introduce certain regulations?
Yeah. We've seen some of that happen in this year. But at the same time, if RBI were to have a liquidity window for NBFCs, and you have to set aside some GSECs equivalent of an SLR for that with the RBI as security, and against that, RBI says that we are here to provide that last backstop on liquidity. I think it creates tremendous confidence, and you would not see the liquidity problem resulting into solvency that could happen with some of these NBFCs.
Sure.
The other thing, that as India has to grow, the consumer business has to grow. For the consumer business to grow, giving many more credit cards is vital for our economy. It doesn't mean that you're going to over leverage the customer. We're so far away from that. But we have to just enable the customer. But the RBI does not give NBFCs standalone credit card license. Now, when I see NBFCs like ourselves for the last 15 years, we probably have the largest experience on the consumer lending side. I don't think there is anybody else who does 100,000 loans a day. We'll do this year almost 30 million loans. We understand the consumer. We have a co-branded credit card that performs very well. So one can see from experience who are the better NBFCs and give them some of these facilities, because if we have to digitize this country, if we have to enable this country and help it grow, then those companies that are doing that, you should support them as well.
You need to own the credit card business entirely on your own, is what you're saying. You don't want to work in a co-branded situation.
Correct, because we understand the consumer risk. We have the collection capability, so we are doing all the work anyway. We're just giving some money to our bank partners because the license is with them. So I think we have to get away from this. This is license Raj in another way in financial services. We have to get away from that.
Okay. You did say that you were hopeful that the government would give growth an impetus. Any ideas for growth from you or from within your team at CII? You all have been discussing this. How would you like to see the government go about, maybe its fiscal expansion if it chooses to, either through tax giveaways or spending giveaways or income in the hands of farmers? What do you think might be the most effective route?
When an economy slows down, it takes time to slow down. Same way when it has to pick up, it will take time to pick up. And we've come to a very low growth rate. And that's why I think one thing to do is to just put or create incentives for the average consumer to buy another house, to buy another car. So I would say cut GST on autos. You could cut it for 12, 18 months. Yes, it will cause some bleeding. But if the economy picks up, growth picks up, your denominator will also go up.
Correct.
Your deficit as a percentage will come back in a couple of years. So I would say that is something to do. Second is, we have talked of Make in India. We want to bring the world here. We have to be consistent then across what we do when we want to attract the world over here. And why attract the world over here? How about attracting Indian business over here? So I would say that while the move on corporate tax was a good move, but just keep one low rate for everybody. For example, when the low rates were announced, what did we do? We cut some of our prices to customers. We increased salary for our lower bottom 50% of our employees. And we'll see what our board does for our shareholders end of the year. So we distributed some of that.
Right.
And if everybody starts doing that, that's how you start building the economy. So I would say take a look at corporate tax rates as well. Even though the government increased personal income tax rates and increased it on the super rich, and if the super rich, I'm a poor guy, but the super rich don't like it, but nobody likes to talk about it. But if we want to build this economy, incentivize everybody, motivate everybody, get everybody excited towards it, then you will see how India will grow.
All right, Mr. Bajaj, thank you very much for your time here in Davos.
Thank you.
And I'm glad we did it inside. Were we to talk outside, we would have never been able to talk in such detail.
True.
So I appreciate your time. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to circle around on our very first broadcast to you from here at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting 2020. Lots more coming up on BloombergQuint.